December 14, 1979. Record stores across the United Kingdom receive a double album packaged in a sleeve that pays homage to Elvis Presley's first record. But instead of the king holding a guitar aloft, there's a blurred image of a young man mid-destruction, bass guitar raised high, about to smash it into the stage. The album is called London Calling. The band is The Clash. Within weeks, it would peak at number 9 on the UK charts. Within a decade, Rolling Stone magazine would name it the best album of the 1980s. Today, it sits at number 16 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. But the story behind this masterpiece isn't one of triumph and glory. It's a story about desperation. About a band on the brink of collapse, drowning in debt, torn apart by legal battles, and staring down the possibility that punk rock, the movement they'd helped create, had already burned itself out. This is the story of how The Clash gambled everything on 6 weeks in a converted church, guided by a producer their record label despised, and how they created not just an album but a blueprint for what rock and roll could become. By early 1979, The Clash were in trouble. Their first 2 albums had earned critical acclaim and built a devoted following. They'd become known as the only band that matters, a nickname they'd given themselves with typical punk arrogance. But behind the revolutionary rhetoric and sold-out shows, the financial reality was brutal. Tours cost more than they made. CBS Records had them locked into an exploitative contract that kept them perpetually in debt, every tour requiring new loans from the label just to break even. Joe Strummer, the band's firebrand frontman, would later tell Melody Maker they were economically really tight. That was putting it mildly. They were essentially broke. Then came the management crisis. Bernard Rhodes, the man who had assembled The Clash in 1976 and shaped their early image, had become a problem. Rhodes was brilliant but controlling, fond of engineering bizarre schemes like trying to trade band members with the Sex Pistols just for the chaos of it. His acceptance of an onerous CBS contract had put the band in their current financial hole. In late 1978, tired of his manipulation, The Clash fired Rhodes. He responded by suing them, freezing what little cash flow they had. The band lost their rehearsal space in Camden and had to scramble to find somewhere new to work. And perhaps worst of all, their main songwriters, Joe Strummer and Mick Jones, were stuck. They hadn't written a new song in over a year. The well had run dry. The punk explosion of 1977 felt like ancient history. By 1979, the movement seemed exhausted, reduced to a fashion statement and empty rebellion. Even the title track of their upcoming album would address this directly, with Strummer's snarling dismissal of phony Beatlemania having bitten the dust, a reference to a West End theatrical production that had tried to bottle and sell the magic of the Beatles' peak years. The Clash needed to evolve or die, and they owed CBS Records a 3rd album. Time was running out. The solution came in the form of a man nobody could find. Guy Stevens was a legend in British music circles, but by 1979 he was also a cautionary tale. Born in East Dulwich in 1943, Stevens had been instrumental in bringing American rhythm and blues to Britain in the 1960s. He'd run the influential Sue Records label, introducing UK audiences to artists like Ike and Tina Turner and Chuck Berry. He'd named and produced Procol Harum and Mott the Hoople. He'd also spent time in Wormwood Scrubs prison for drug offenses, watched his precious record collection get stolen during a breakdown, and developed serious problems with alcohol and amphetamines. By 1979, Guy Stevens had largely disappeared from the music industry. He moved frequently, never stayed long in one place, rarely had a phone number anyone could use. When The Clash told CBS they wanted Stevens to produce their new album, the label was horrified. Hiring Stevens seemed like professional suicide. But The Clash knew what they needed. They'd heard Mott the Hoople's early records and understood that Stevens could capture something raw and real. They recognized his influence on the British beat and blues booms of the 1960s. how the Rolling Stones and The Who had used his encyclopedic knowledge of American soul and R&B to inform their own sound. So Joe Strummer did what had to be done. He went looking. Strummer combed the pubs of Oxford Street, asking around, leaving messages. When Stevens finally surfaced, the band made their pitch. Despite his reputation for chaos, despite CBS's objections, despite everything that could go wrong, they wanted him. Stevens said yes. Years later, Strummer would explain the logic. At least there's someone around who's as bad as us, if not worse. All the dreadful life-wrecking things that have happened to him. It wasn't just about Stevens's past successes. It was about finding someone who understood that making great rock and roll sometimes meant embracing the chaos rather than fighting it. Someone who wouldn't try to make them sound radio-friendly or commercially viable. Someone who would help them be more themselves, not less. Before they could think about recording, The Clash needed songs. And they had almost nothing. They found a new rehearsal space, Vanilla Studios, located in the back of a garage in Pimlico. Tour manager Johnny Green and drum roadie Baker had secured it after the band lost their Camden location. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. In May 1979, The Clash arrived at Vanilla with blank notebooks and cold instruments. For songwriters who'd been experiencing a year-long creative drought, the pressure was immense. But something about the new space, the new urgency, broke the dam. Mick Jones would compose and arrange the music, his guitar work showing influences far beyond punk, rockabilly, reggae, jazz, classic rock and roll. Joe Strummer would write the lyrics, drawing from newspapers, personal observations, political anger, and cultural commentary. Strummer famously wrote Lost in the Supermarket, after imagining Jones's childhood growing up in a basement flat with his mother and grandmother. A meditation on consumer culture and emotional emptiness. They recorded rough demos on a 4-track TIAC recorder. These tapes, later dubbed the Vanilla tapes, would capture early versions of 15 of the 19 songs that would appear on London Calling. Some were barely formed. Instrumental tracks with working titles like Paul's Tune, which would become The Guns of Brixton, and Up Tune, which became The Right Profile. Bassist Paul Simonon would write his first ever Clash song during these sessions, The Guns of Brixton, inspired partly by Jimmy Cliff's film The Harder They Come, and partly by his experiences growing up in a racially diverse area where police violence was a constant threat. The Vanilla sessions revealed something crucial. The Clash were no longer a pure punk band. They were absorbing everything around them. The reggae that Simonon grew up with in Brixton, the rockabilly and rhythm and blues they'd been listening to on their American tours, the ska that was experiencing a revival through bands like The Specials. Notably, 4 songs that would appear on London Calling weren't recorded during the Vanilla sessions at all. Spanish Bombs, Wrong Emboyo, The Card Cheat, and Train in Vain would be written later, some even during the actual album recording sessions. By August 1979, they had enough material. It was time to record. Wessex Studios sat in a converted church in Highbury, North London. The studio had already seen plenty of punk history. The Sex Pistols had recorded there, as had the Pretenders and Tom Robinson Band. Engineer Bill Price knew the space intimately, had developed unique recording techniques to capture the room's natural ambience despite its acoustically dead character. In August 1979, The Clash walked into Wessex with Guy Stevens. What happened over the next 5 to 6 weeks would become the stuff of rock and roll legend. Stevens' production methods were unconventional, to put it mildly. He didn't sit calmly in the control room, twiddling knobs and discussing frequencies. He was a vibe merchant, a conductor of chaos, a catalyst for emotional truth. During recording sessions, Stevens would suddenly charge out of the control room and begin a violent assault on the studio space, thrashing his limbs, dancing wildly, screaming in band members' faces. He'd swing ladders around the room and overturn chairs, apparently to create what he called a rock and roll atmosphere. When Joe Strummer was recording piano on one track, Stevens decided he didn't like the way it sounded. His solution? He rushed out of the control room and poured an entire bottle of red wine over Strummer's hands and into the piano, either to make it sound better or simply to make him stop, depending on who's telling the story. Paul Simonon surprisingly got along best with Stevens. He found the producer's chaos liberating rather than frustrating. Years later, Simonon would recall Stevens telling him not to worry about a bass error on Spanish Bombs, that the best rock and roll songs have mistakes, that excitement and spontaneity mattered more than perfection. This completely relaxed Simonon, allowing him to deliver some of his finest performances on the album. But while Stevens created the atmosphere, engineer Bill Price did the actual technical work. Price meticulously handled the overdubbing and mixing while Stevens went about breaking furniture and, on at least one occasion, falling downstairs. The partnership worked precisely because of this division of labor. Stevens as the mad shaman, Price as the skilled craftsman capturing the magic. The band worked 18-hour days. Many songs were recorded in 1 or 2 takes. The first track they recorded was Brand New Cadillac, a cover of a 1959 rockabilly song by Vince Taylor, a song The Clash had been using as a warm-up exercise. Clampdown started as an instrumental called Working and Waiting. For the card cheat, they recorded each part twice to create what Jones called a sound as big as possible. The recordings were raw but powerful, capturing a band operating at creative peak. And despite the chaos, despite Stevens' theatrical destruction, the band trusted him completely. Mick Jones would later say Stevens' presence made all the difference, that all the messy sound went into him, and what emerged on tape was clarity. September 21, 1979, The Palladium, New York City. The Clash were on their Take the Fifth U.S. tour, and photographer Penny Smith had been following them for weeks. That night, she'd been invited out with friends but chose to attend the show instead. She positioned herself stage right on Paul Simonon's side rather than her usual spot near Mick Jones. The Palladium had fixed seating. Unlike the raucous punk venues the Clash were used to in London, places where audiences stood, jumped, crashed into each other, this was a theater. Bouncers kept the crowd seated, creating a stiff, unresponsive atmosphere. By the final song, White Riot, Simonon's frustration had reached a boiling point. The whole point of punk was the exchange of energy between band and audience. Without that, what was the point of any of this? Simonon grabbed his Fender Precision bass by the neck. He raised it high above his head like an axe. And as Penny Smith lifted her Pentax ECI camera, he brought the bass crashing down onto the hard stage floor. The instrument splintered, neck cracked, frets parted, solid body split straight down the center. The tension on the strings held the remains together loosely. Simonon's watch stopped at exactly 9:50 p.m. Smith captured the moment just before impact. Simonon with the bass raised high, his face in shadow, body twisted with the force of the impending destruction. She didn't want to use the photograph. She thought it was too out of focus, too blurry. I said, "It's completely out of focus," Smith recalled. But Joe wouldn't have it. He said, "That one is the photo." Strummer was right. Graphic designer Ray Lowry took Smith's photograph and styled it after the cover of Elvis Presley's 1956 debut album. The same pink and green color scheme, the same bold text treatment. But where Elvis held his guitar high as a symbol of rock and roll's birth, here was the Clash destroying one to signal either its death or its rebirth. The image would become one of the most iconic photographs in rock history. In 2002, Q magazine would name it the greatest rock and roll photograph of all time. As the Clash wrapped up the London Calling sessions, the NME music paper approached them with an idea. Would they record a song to be included as a promotional flexi-disc giveaway with the magazine? Mick Jones and the band quickly wrote and recorded a love song. Jones sang lead vocals, and the lyrics appeared to reference the end of his volatile relationship with Viv Albertine of the Slits. The song had a jangly, almost country and western feel, far more melodic and pop-oriented than anything else on the album. Then the NME deal fell through. The flexi-disc wasn't happening, but The Clash had this song just sitting there. A spare track recorded as a giveaway, now homeless. At the last minute, they decided to add it to London Calling. There was just one problem. The album sleeves had already been printed and were in production. There was no time to redesign them. The solution was makeshift but fitting. The song was added to the fourth side of the vinyl, but it wasn't listed on the album sleeve or labels. Only in the runoff groove, the space between the last listed track and the center label, was its title scratched into the vinyl. Train in Vain. When fans first bought London Calling, many assumed the album simply ended with Revolution Rock. Then the needle kept playing, and this unexpected pop song emerged. Melodic, radio-friendly, and utterly different from everything that came before. Some listeners thought it was called Stand By Me because of the chorus. But Jones titled it Train in Vain, partly to avoid confusion with Benny King's 1961 classic, and partly because the title referenced his ex-girlfriend's description of his behavior, taking the train to her place in Shepherd's Bush and being left outside, bleating on the doorstep. The song became The Clash's first US Top 40 hit, peaking at number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the most pop-oriented track they'd ever recorded, and it became one of their biggest commercial successes. The Clash had recorded 19 songs over 5 to 6 weeks. When they presented the material to CBS Records, the label saw a problem. This was nearly a double album's worth of music. Double albums cost more to manufacture and carried a higher retail price. The label balked, but The Clash insisted. They wanted to give fans value for their money. After fighting with CBS over contracts and creative control for years, this was one battle they were determined to win. They reached a compromise. London Calling would be released as a double album, but it would retail for barely more than the price of a single LP. In the UK, it sold for around £5, an unprecedented deal that frustrated CBS executives but delighted fans. The band members saw it as keeping faith with their audience. Punk rock had always been about rejecting corporate greed and maintaining a connection with working-class kids who couldn't afford expensive records. The album was released in the UK on December 14, 1979, and in the US in January 1980. Critical reception was mixed at first. Charles Shaar Murray in the NME, the same writer who had once dismissed The Clash as a band that should be returned to their garage, preferably with the motor running, now praised it as the album that finally lived up to the band's hype. But Gary Bushell in Sounds magazine awarded it just 2 stars, complaining there was no hunger, no vision, nothing that made you go wow. The record-buying public disagreed with Bushell. The album peaked at number 9 in the UK and climbed to number 27 in the United States. It sold approximately 2 million copies in its first years of release. More importantly, other musicians were listening. The genre-blending ambition, the refusal to be constrained by punk orthodoxy, the way The Clash mixed social commentary with musical adventure, it opened doors for countless artists who would follow. London Calling opens with its title track, an apocalyptic warning that borrows its title from the BBC World Service's wartime broadcasts. The song references the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident from earlier in 1979, Thames River flooding fears, and the band's own financial desperation. As Strummer snarls about drowning and nuclear errors, Mick Jones's guitar creates a hypnotic staccato riff that would become one of the most recognizable in rock history. From there, the album refuses to stay in one place. Brand New Cadillac is pure rockabilly. Jimmy Jazz incorporates jazz and New Orleans R&B. Rudy Can't Fail bounces with ska rhythms. Spanish Bombs reflects on the Spanish Civil War and modern terrorism. The Right Profile tells the tragic story of Montgomery Clift's car accident. Lost in the Supermarket captures the alienation of consumer culture. Clampdown is an anti-fascist anthem urging young people to resist authoritarianism. The Guns of Brixton, Paul Simonon's first songwriting credit, explores police violence and paranoia in Black British communities. Death or Glory finds Strummer examining his life and acknowledging the complications of adulthood. Coca-Cola satirizes American corporate culture. The Card Cheat builds into an epic orchestral rock statement. Lovers Rock advocates safe sex, with Strummer nervously squawking at the end to deflate any preachiness. Four Horsemen gallops with martial pride. I'm Not Down is Jones' defiant response to depression. Revolution Rock channels dub reggae. Train in Vain closes with unexpected pop perfection. The lyrics range from deeply personal to broadly political, from humor to rage, from hope to despair. But through it all, there's a sense of adults grappling with an imperfect world rather than teenagers simply rejecting it. Guy Stevens died on August 29, 1981, just under 2 years after his greatest triumph. He was only 38 years old. An overdose of prescription drugs he'd been taking to combat his alcohol dependency caused a fatal heart attack. The Clash responded with Midnight to Stevens, a languid ballad freighted with the kind of melodramatic hyperbole the producer would have loved. As for the band, they followed London Calling with Sandinista, a sprawling triple album that showed even greater ambition but less focus. Then came Combat Rock in 1982, which included their biggest American hit, Rock the Casbah, but internal tensions were tearing them apart. Drummer Topper Headon was fired in 1982 due to his heroin addiction. The following year, Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon fired Mick Jones, the guitarist who'd founded the band, in a decision manipulated by the returning manager Bernard Rhodes. The Clash briefly continued with replacement members, releasing the critically panned Cut the Crap in 1985 before disbanding entirely. Joe Strummer died suddenly in 2002 at age 50, ending any possibility of a reunion. When the Clash accepted an Ivor Novello Award for their outstanding contribution to British music in 2001, Strummer grabbed the microphone and declared, "This is for Guy Stevens." London Calling didn't save punk rock. It transcended it. In 1989, Rolling Stone magazine named it the best album of the 1980s, despite technically being released in 1979 in the UK. The magazine defended the choice by noting its US release came in January 1980, and besides, nobody could suggest a better alternative. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it 8th on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. That ranking held in 2012 and dropped only slightly to 16th in 2020. Q magazine called it the 4th greatest British album ever and among the very best albums ever recorded. The BBC profiled it in their Radio 1 Masterpieces series. In 2007, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2010, the UK Royal Mail featured its cover on a commemorative postage stamp. The album has sold over 5 million copies worldwide. It's been certified platinum in the United States. More importantly, it's influenced generation after generation of musicians, from Green Day to The Strokes, from Rage Against the Machine to Arctic Monkeys. What makes London Calling endure isn't just the quality of individual songs, though many are classics. It's the album's fundamental statement, that rock and roll could grow up without losing its edge. That you could experiment with genre without compromising your principles. That anger and intelligence weren't mutually exclusive. That a band could make music that was both deeply political and wildly entertaining. The Clash proved that punk's three-chord fury was a beginning, not an endpoint. They showed that the DIY ethos could produce something ambitious and cinematic, not just raw and simple. They demonstrated that you could honor rock and roll's past, from Elvis to reggae to rockabilly, while forging something entirely new. In 6 weeks at Wessex Studios, with a producer who poured wine into pianos and threw ladders during takes, a broke and desperate band created one of the most important rock albums ever made. They called it London Calling. And 45 years later, we're still answering.